Welcome to the Dallas Duo Podcast,
your weekly wellness coffee date.
We're friends in Dallas, always looking for the best ways to optimize our health
and have fun along the way. Welcome back to the Dallas Duo Podcast. Have you ever left a doctor's appointment feeling like something is off, but still been handed a piece of paper saying everything is normal?
The moment we realize that normal labs are not actually normal and aren't built for women going into perimenopause in our 30s is a game-changing light bulb moment. And I think as a clinician, but also as a patient, I have learned over the years that labs are needed, but they're also not checked appropriately. And some of the things that we experience don't even show up in labs either. In today's episode, in our peri-prep toolkit, we're going to talk all about labs, which ones matter, which ones to get, how to get them, how to look into this. And over the past decade working in private practice, I've put together a really nice concentrated list. So make sure you stay till the end, and we have PDF cheat sheet for you to get the ball rolling on really moving the needle on your health in an assertive way. I think this whole podcast is really talking about like being an advocate for your health, like in lots of different areas. And today really hones in on that.
Absolutely. And I hope that listeners get something from this podcast. I hope that they will share it with a friend, a family member, because that's really valuable information. And like you said, a great cheat sheet to at least get a start on some good lab work for yourself.
That's actually such a good point, because I feel so thankful that I have like an incredible medical village. Not everybody has a pediatrician or a DO or a pelvic floor physical therapist as their bestie that they can just text whenever and say, is this normal? What do you think about these labs? Give me a second opinion. But having an informed village makes such a difference. So if we can be part of your informed village to give you a resource and just to even get curious, I think is such an important strategy in this phase of life.
And another thing, I know you feel the same way, Whitney, is, I think normal is such, I don't want to say a bad description, but to me, it's like, I want to feel optimal. I don't want to just feel normal. And so having that knowledge and empowering yourself with knowledge is, the best way to go.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because a lot of my patients, when they get their labs back from Quest or LabCorp, they review them before we review them together. And they say like, hey, my lab said that they're normal. And I just want to point out that when LabCorp or Quest are sending those, there are standard reference ranges that are put on that form. And sometimes they do align with what is considered normal. But I want you to realize that those ranges do not change based on age or gender and or specific diagnosis. So if you are a perimenopause female with insulin resistance, like those ranges have not changed. But in my head, the ranges do change because normal and optimal are very different, or normal and lack of disease, or normal and prevention of disease, those ranges look very different. So just because your labs come back and they're not flagged doesn't mean that your provider might not flag those labs as abnormal, which is so important to have that second reference range that you review with your doctor, because most individuals who are practicing not just functional medicine, but modern medicine would say that a thyroid TSH value of 3.5 isn't normal, even though the reference range of 1 to 4 is what we usually see on a LabCorp test.
That's a really great point. And it's so nuanced, like you said.
It is so nuanced. I'm interested. Okay, so if we talk a little bit about like our stories with labs and what we've experienced, I'm interested to know, like, what is your experience with labs? Have you had doctors that you feel like are really comprehensive? Have you had good or bad experiences being your own advocate?
I hadn't had labs done in several years. And so what I consider my starting point for this phase of life was when I did the nourishment program with you, and we were focusing on blood sugar balance. And so you ordered some labs for me because I had some concerns. And so working with you on that was really eye-opening, because I loved how we got the information, discussed it, and then based on that and the symptoms that I was having, you made some recommendations, and there were some specific vitamins and minerals that were, low, and so there was some supplementation that needed to happen in order to help improve those numbers. And so that's kind of what got the ball rolling. And then I started working with a functional OB-GYN, who since then I've had blood work done with her. And I think my overall perspective of it now is like they're data points, but it's a journey. You're not going to fix everything everything like all at once. And it's important to get it done, get the information from it, implement some changes and then do it again so you can see how things are measuring up. But I do think it's really important, the labs, and then also in combination with, as a patient, like tracking your symptoms, keeping good notes on like how you're feeling once you start taking things. And that way you really can look back and see, am I actually feeling better? Because sometimes it's just small changes, but I think it's like a combination of like getting the data from the labs and then really paying attention and communicating with your providers.
I think you made two really good points. Symptoms and labs both matter. So sometimes symptoms give us insight into labs that may be abnormal, but sometimes symptoms give us symptoms that need to be addressed that might not show up on your labs and they still matter, which is so important why you are your own advocate. Because at the end of the day, your provider, as much as they are there to help you and be an informed expert, they do not know your inner workings. They cannot guess what is going on inside. So it is your job. Like, they're not God. It's your job to tell them what's happening so that we can connect the dots, because it tells so much of the story, especially in perimenopause when there's a hormone component going on, that I might know that there's some insulin resistance that's being built during this season because of fluctuating hormones, but it's so helpful if you tell me that you're lethargic after meals or you're having big energy swings, because it helps me paint a picture. So that is something so important to point out. And the other aspect is the targeted supplementation. I personally feel that we would have so much less supplementation if people had accurate labs, because targeted supplementation looks so different than AG1, Haya, a random multivitamin, hair, nails, gummy that you decided to take from your favorite influencer. Like, we're just haphazardly taking these random things and these random discounts that come along our Instagram when we're having an insecure moment about some body part. But when we have labs done, we're like, oh, it's clear that I do not need to be taking more vitamin D. Or, whoa, it's clear that I do need magnesium. We are very targeted about supplementation. And why would you want to take something if you don't need it? Supplementation is expensive. And so it's really nice to say, I have this like $80 combo that I'm taking that's directly improving my health, and I don't need to spend any more money.
Yeah, it's much better than taking the approach of like throwing stuff against the wall to see what's stick. And wasting money, because really a lot of this stuff is expensive. I think it's so important to have that targeted supplementation rather than just trying a whole bunch of things and seeing what works. I'm curious about you too, because what has been your experience? I know you've had labs done, especially now in this like postpartum period. And so I'd be so interested to know like what's been your latest experience.
My own lab journey, is really interesting. Baby, I had a really nice window where I really focused on labs. I wore a continuous glucose monitor. I wore a Whoop. I was really focused on data. And then I felt like I got like a little bit burnt out. Like, in that preconception, trying to conceive period, I really did everything I could to be in optimal health. During the window where my mom was going through her health journey, I stopped all data and wearables. I just felt like I didn't have margin for my health. And so I kind of like let my health take a back burner.
And that was going on at the same time, which I mean, I don't know if you mentioned that.
Yeah, so it was going on at the same time. So I got pregnant July, and my mom had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in January. And we had started trying, I think, in April. So I think this is also a good thing to point out, is that even as a nutrition expert, it took me 3 months to get pregnant. So throwing that out there. I never used a fertility tracker or anything. I just decided which days I was ovulating and prayed. But I think that those few years really set me up nicely of having a good baseline, knowing that I didn't have any major deficiencies. My health was in a good place. My body fat and my muscle mass was in a good place before I got pregnant. But during that pregnancy and postpartum window with like grief and being overwhelmed and finding like a new me and breastfeeding for 28 months, I got really, really, really depleted. And I say that from somebody who was using a prepared meal service, has a supportive husband, only has one child, has 2 degrees in healthcare, knows how to eat right, was taking electrolytes, was working out. Like, I was doing all the things. Like
All the right things.
on paper, I was so on point. And I point this out because just because you're doing all the things does not mean that you've moved the needle. And
Mhm.
so when I did labs, I was under the assumption that the reason I was tired was because I was a mom. The reason
Mhm.
I was tired was because I have a toddler, or, this is a new phase. This is a new me.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case at all. And so this is like so important, I think, for people to realize is that tired is common, but it's not normal.
Mhm.
And my vitamin D, my vitamin B, my iron, my ferritin were all not optimal and were all driving really strong fatigue symptoms.
Mhm.
And the day that I started the targeted supplementation and even just like diet strategies, I felt like I was taking speed that week. Like the energy shift was so immense.
Mhm.
And it really just solidified for me how important lab work is from even an annual basis. I'm not looking for people to do it quarterly or even every 6 months, depending on budget. But I think that it can really help overachievers prevent burnout because as like a type A mama, I'm like, oh, I'm fine. Like I'm tired, but I'm just going to drink an extra coffee. I'm tired, but I'm just going to push through. And that drives even worse health. And
Mhm.
so for me to have labs that say like, well, this is why you're tired and to give me more targeted solutions, it's helped me not overwork in areas that aren't going to move the needle.
You bring up a really important point, which I think as women, we are more apt to brush things off and say, like, I'm feeling this way because I have a toddler and that's why I'm tired. Or, for me, it was more like, well, of course I feel anxious. My oldest is going to college and I'm not managing stress well. And so, of course, I feel a little depressed. Of course, I feel a little anxious. And those situational things, they are real and they do contribute to that. But sometimes there is more that is going on than just what is happening in your life. There's more that's going on in your body. That's when I was like entering that perimenopause phase, but it was this perfect storm of like life circumstances and hormonal things that were going on in my body that were shifting things in my brain. And I think I told you this the other day, but I think that had I not taken the approach of like, I need to learn more about perimenopause and what's happening in my body, I could have easily been diagnosed with like anxiety and ADHD and maybe even depression because that's where all of my symptoms were lying in those categories.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you present such an interesting point is that not just in your 30s, like not just as you approach hormonal changes, but in general for women, I find that there's two things that happen that we are either gaslit by professionals, but we are also gaslit by other women. And this is so important. And I feel like why I have been so lucky is because so many of my friends are healthcare professionals that if I say, hey, I'm feeling anxious or whatever, they're not gaslighting me. It's like the
Mhm.
opposite. They're like, "Ooh, hey, what about doing EMDR for your trauma? What about looking into your vitamin levels? What about looking into the fact that like you may be low in X, which is driving symptoms?"
Mhm.
I feel like they're enablers, if anything. But most women who come to me are like, "Oh, well, my mom said that when she got into her 50s, this started too, and that's normal." We've
Mhm.
normalized patterns, societal patterns, and ones that are in our family, and that often prevents women from getting lab done, like from getting help. Saying like, oh, my mom also started to develop this like tire of weight around her abdomen in her 40s. And that's just happens to all of our family members. We all carry weight there.
Mhm.
Just because everybody in your family is that way doesn't mean that it's normal or healthy or good for your body. And so I think it is important to be really careful about who you take advice from when we talk about health, because yes, genetics load the gun, but your environment really pulls the trigger. And we have to be careful about not normalizing those unhealthy things.
Yes, like you said, something's a pattern doesn't mean it's good or that it is truly normal.
I have a lot of patients now who are like, oh, wow, I have PCOS. And I now realize that my entire family does too.
Mm.
Instead of saying, like, oh, my whole family is overweight and struggling with insulin resistance. That's just the way we are. It's like, no, nobody else in my family has taken action on their insulin resistance, but I'm going to. I'm going to change the pattern. And I think that that's what labs does is it helps us know when and where and how to make targeted health changes.
Mhm.
and to give us confidence in the things that are okay, that
Yes.
are doing well, like that are organs that are working. I had a conversation with a patient this morning who was like, "Oh, well, my chiropractor said I could take X, Y, and Z to help my liver." I'm like, "Your liver function is perfect and we don't need that support. Like, you actually
Mm.
don't need to be focusing on liver health because we have labs that show that."
That show that it's functioning and it's healthy and all the things. Yeah.
Yeah. So even for like my hypochondriac girlies, who are like, "Oh, well, I could do more X, Y, and Z." Like, you could, yeah, but you might not need to put your effort into that basket. We might need
Mhm.
to put those eggs somewhere else.
I do want to backtrack a little and say it is real that some people in their 40s start to experience anxiety and depression and like those things are real. But I'm saying in my case,
Mental health is really important and needs to
yes.
be supported. But like you're saying, like antidepressant or an SSRI might not be the answer if there's another deficiency going on.
Yes, which was the case, so there were things that I needed to do and some lifestyle things too, as
Mhm.
far as, stress management and sleep. I mean, sleep is another big one that,
Yeah.
that's not measured by a lab, but it makes such a big difference.
There are some labs that I want to talk about because I think that they, just from a checklist standpoint, like people will have access to a checklist to review, but there are some common labs that don't ever get checked or that do get checked that have really different ranges than what people think that I would like love to talk through because I think that people assume that their doctors are giving them good feedback. And I don't want to be like hyperbolic and say, like, your doctor isn't giving you the right info.
Mhm.
But oftentimes, doctors don't have the optimal ranges that for
Mm.
else could really make you feel better.
Okay, so you want to talk about the labs that may be like overlooked first, and then
Yeah.
we can talk about the top
Yeah.
10 labs. I think your list was that you definitely don't want to miss if you're in your 30s or 40s.
Okay, so labs that oftentimes get overlooked. Ferritin is a big one. Dr. Heather Finley has come on here and talked about ferritin before. But if you are fatigued and you have someone do an iron panel, they might not add on ferritin. Ferritin is an additional piece, and it's the most missed deficiency in menstruating women. Most of my patients never have an optimal ferritin. That's a very strong word, never, but it's true. This year, I have seen ferritin as low as 4. I've seen a lot of those. It wasn't just one patient. And so if you're constantly getting an iron panel and your iron panel is showing up normal, that's not the same thing as ferritin. Ferritin is your stored iron, and it's not just taking more iron that drives that value to increase. So at least getting the value checked. For an iron panel, you need your serum iron checked, but you also need the TIBC, ferritin, percent saturation to really know the full picture of what's preventing that iron storage from happening.
If someone orders labs, say just like a general lab panel for you, is ferritin usually not one of the things that would be on there?
No.
Okay.
I have only really seen ferritin checked if a patient goes to a hematologist, goes to an expert, they
Mhm.
request it, or if they're doing like an advanced panel for IVF or fertility. It's really interesting. That's usually like the first time the insulin gets checked. Those
Oh,
doctors are like doing the work. But otherwise, ferritin is almost never checked.
okay. Wow, that's really surprising, especially because for so many autoimmune things or, just because of the symptoms that present when that is low or high.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting. The other one is an advanced lipid panel. So, when we look at cholesterol, oftentimes if you have an elevated LDL or an elevated HDL, your doctor will say we may need to consider medication or we need you to eat a low fat diet or some random outdated recommendations. An advanced lipid panel looks at LDL and breaks it down into subcategories. So, LDL is not necessarily increasing your risk for cardiovascular disease, but when we look at the LDL particle size, we look at essentially what that cholesterol is made of and if it's heavy and sticky. So I like to think of it as when you're vacuuming, there are certain things that come up very quickly when you vacuum, like dust and whatnot. But if your toddler has spilled gum or pudding or something on the ground, that vacuum is not going to be able to scoop it up. So, very much like arterial health, if there is heavier, stickier cholesterol in there that can't be moved as well by fiber through your body, we need to be aware of that because that's increasing your cardiovascular risk. But we don't know the type of dirt that's in there unless we look at the advanced lipid panel. So it gives us a better way to determine, is their cardiovascular risk present? And will my dietary and lifestyle changes make a difference? Or is it more genetic? And so this helps doctors decide, will a statin, will medication actually help? Would dietary changes help? What choices should I make to move this? So sometimes we see like, oh, this is increased because of carbohydrate choices, because of inflammation, because of the way you're eating, or maybe you have an incredibly healthy diet that fits your lifestyle, but this is really genetic and we need medication help because solely based on our genetic profile.
Okay. And that's one thing I always find a little bit confusing are the ranges for cholesterol and, looking at the big picture, not just, what the number is and, like getting afraid because it might be high.
Well, and I think that is, you raise such a good point. I think that's like a really more modern thing. We used to look at like total cholesterol as a big issue, but if you have really high HDL, which is like your healthy, happy cholesterol, the higher that number gets, obviously the higher your total is going to get. So we do like to separate them and look at HDL. I personally like to see the HDL is above 50, closer to 65.
Hmm.
That is the type of cholesterol that is essentially your duster. It is like going through your arteries. It is like cleaning really well. It's getting into like the nitty gritty areas and improving cardiovascular health by decreasing the overall risk. That usually comes from increasing physical activity and eating more unsaturated fats, which are all from plant fats.
Okay. So like avocado, olive oil.
Avocado, olives, nuts, seeds, with the exception of coconut. It's a misnomer. It's mostly saturated fat. Chia, flax, all of those unsaturated fat sources are going to support the increase of HDL.
Right.
So if your HDL increases, even though your LDL hasn't moved, it still decreases your total risk because we have more of the healthy stuff there.
Okay. That's good to know because I think that is confusing for a lot of people.
Yeah. So there's a really nice like Boston Heart Health advanced lipid panel that you can run. I think it's like $50 to $150, but it's so helpful because it breaks down all the details about your LDL. Like what type of particle is it? How many do I have? Is it that heavy sticky stuff? Is it really staying around for a long period of time or is it flushing out? Do I have the right things on board to improve cardiovascular health? And it gives us a good picture of like, is this diet driven? Like did my lifestyle do this or did my genetics do this? And that gives us a lot of peace of mind.
That's really, and what test did you say that was? What specific one?
I think it's called the Boston Heart Health Test, but like it's an add-on that most labs can do, and it's really nice for individuals to consider. Yeah, Boston. I'll have to find it.
Okay, cool. No, that's interesting. Well, I feel like the next one on the list is really interesting because that is your specialty. So
Yeah. So fasting insulin and glucose. So I'm so passionate about this because I worked in endocrinology for so long and I would see 40 to 50 patients a week. And so many of them came to me with an elevated hemoglobin A1C that was already elevated. So hemoglobin A1C is a 3-month average of your blood sugar, but it doesn't check insulin levels. And insulin is the driver of an elevated A1C because elevated insulin is insulin resistance at its core. And what's so incredibly fascinating to me is that checking a fasting insulin is 5 times more sensitive than an A1C in catching early insulin resistance. So if you think elevated insulin is down here and elevated A1C is further years down the line, wouldn't we want to catch something when it's a small hole, like a small anthill and not this large mountain? And so when we check fasting insulin, your fasting insulin might be elevated, which shows tiny signs of insulin resistance, even though your A1C is normal. That's the perfect time to say, early prevention, early action, let's make changes now so that I never have long-term glucose dysfunction years from now and even have diabetes on my radar. We can make changes really early on. And insulin resistance can come from a lot of different areas, but oftentimes this is from having too much excess carbohydrate around in your body. That isn't necessarily because you're eating too many carbohydrates. It could also be because your body's inefficient at using them, from maybe low muscle mass, from only doing cardiovascular exercise, from being really, really stressed out all the time that causes your glucose to always be high, from not sleeping enough, which drives your blood sugar higher. There's other pieces besides diet that can push fasting insulin up, but it's such an incredible measure and it's so cheap to do. You can order it through Quest yourself, but it tells you, hey, am I like pre-diabetic? Is there work that I could be doing now to improve these values so that I don't even get there? Not a lot of disease states have that type of data available to you. So I find it so actionable and love to get this checked in every single human that I see.
It can be a very important preventative test that you can do to get some insight.
A couple years ago, I had a patient who had a really strong family history of diabetes, and she had come to me because she was in her 20s. She had moved to a new city and she wanted to lose weight. That's a total fine reason to work with a dietitian. But my thought was, well, why do we have a weight issue in the first place? And let's do some labs to kind of see where we are, if there's any supplementation that would help this picture. And her fasting insulin was elevated. It was 17, but her A1C was completely normal. And she was like, oh, well, my mom has prediabetes, my dad has diabetes, my both grandparents have diabetes. And we had a very clear talk of like, hey, like this number is abnormal. It's elevated. It's above 6. It's 3 times higher than it needs to be. If we increase muscle mass, increase movement, change the type of carbohydrates you're eating to spike your blood sugar less, change your plate to be more fulfilling and more satisfying, we can change this in the next 3 months. And you may never have to worry about this again. But if you don't make these changes, this is going to continue to worsen and we will have issues in the next few years. We'll start to see that. But she made changes then. Weight loss alone makes you more insulin sensitive, makes your body work better at taking in carbohydrates. But muscle is a natural insulin, meaning the more muscle your body has, the easier it is for your body to pull carbohydrates in naturally and process them without needing to use insulin receptors. So it's essentially like having a secret squad at work that like helps you do your work. Like your boss gives you a big project and then you have like 5 contractors you've hired that they're not aware of. They're like, wow, she is so efficient at her job. And you like have this closet of contractors that you just like bring out to do your job.
So another reason muscle is a hack.
So muscle mass is so incredible. I was thinking about this morning when I was working out. I was like, wow, I would not be able to eat this many carbs if I didn't have this much muscle. Like that's just how it is, right? Like I have built muscle solely for the purpose of wanting to enjoy carbohydrates. So there's a really nice relationship between, it's important to have a provider that understands what affects glucose and what affects insulin. They're not the same, but they have a strong relationship. But I could go on and on. But fasting insulin is incredible, and I check it in all patients, and it can be like $20 to check. So,
okay. Before we move to the next one, though, can you speak a little bit about what can happen in perimenopause, how some people can become more insulin resistant during that period? Why does that?
Definitely. So as our hormones change, so insulin is a hormone. So insulin is affected by, in turn, your other hormones. We see that as progesterone drops and estrogen like increases or changes during perimenopause, and as testosterone changes too, that it can create an environment for increased insulin resistance. So your insulin may rise just because of your other hormones changing, and it responds in tandem because of that. So HRT, muscle mass, eating a lower glycemic diet all supports an environment to decrease that risk from happening. But I see patients who don't know that, don't get testing done, don't know they're in perimenopause, and they think like, oh, I'm gaining weight, and so I just need to like do more cardio or eat less, and they start getting into a situation where they're actually decreasing the nutrients their body needs. They're in too much of a calorie deficit, which stresses their body out. They're doing only cardio, they're losing muscle mass rapidly, and we're just taking the wrong approach to this scenario.
I bring that up just because you hear that all the time. What I've always done isn't working
Isn't
anymore.
working
Or
anymore.
like I'm actually working out more and I'm still gaining weight.
Yep.
So that what you just said explains like the
Yeah.
reason it's
And I
happening.
think like our natural mindset of that is like, okay, like I just need to like move more and eat less. And usually, like, yes, in terms of like, we need to be in a calorie deficit if we want to lose weight. But if you are not lifting weights and doing progressive overload, you're not going to build more muscle and you're not going to become more insulin sensitive. And that is just the very clear formula for success. And a lot of my females in their 35, 40, 45 window are like, well, I've never lifted weights and I don't know how, so I'm certainly not going to start now. That
Mhm.
mindset will not work in this stage.
And if you're restricting, you're really only going to make the problem worse, is
Yeah.
what it's like.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's a hard balance because if you are eating very little and you don't have enough energy to lift weights,
Hmm.
you might have to eat a little bit more to lift weights so that you
Right.
can build muscle. It's like an interesting balance. And so that's where working with a provider is really important. And working with a provider that understands the insulin resistance and hormone relationship, because I cannot tell you how many of my patients go see a doctor and they say, eat 1,200 calories, you'll lose weight, you'll be fine. That's not
Yeah.
the answer.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, this is like the perfect segue into talking about the sex hormone panel.
Yes. So having your sex hormones checked is a really powerful lab, but it is the one that comes with a bunch of caveats next to it and exceptions because in perimenopause, your hormones are shifting. And just in general, your hormones shift regularly throughout the month. You have different phases of your cycle. And so, depending on when you check your cycle, we may not see the lab that is associated with your symptom. And that does not mean that your symptom is not real. It just means that we did not catch it on paper. I usually have patients check on day 3 or day 21 of their cycle, which gives us a better picture of where things might be in dysfunction, but we might not catch it. It is powerful to check testosterone and DHEA though, because that can show us like, do you have muscle mass? Is your testosterone too low? And that can affect your ability to build muscle mass, which can be affected by like, what our dietary patterns look like. And we may be able to help it some there. But this is an area where working with a provider who is either menopause certified or who works with perimenopause on a regular basis is going to understand that you may be having anxiety in the second half of your cycle and you may benefit from like low dose progesterone, but it may not show up on your labs. And this has been really enlightening for me as a provider who doesn't prescribe to work with some of my favorite providers who say, early on, we look at hormones as a guiding light, but
Mhm.
not as an ultimatum. Because on paper, we may not see your symptoms improve, but we may see interventions improve your symptoms with progesterone or with HRT or with supplementation, but we have to go off of what the patient is saying. And so having somebody who listens to you and empathizes is really important.
Yes. And I think also tracking those symptoms, what day of your cycle, how you're
Exactly.
feeling, and seeing
Exactly.
those patterns, because you will see over time, like you said, oh, in the second half of my cycle, I have very up and down emotions. I feel very anxious. I can't sleep. So
Yeah.
noticing those patterns is so important. But again, you have to come in and communicate those.
With hormones, even more importantly than checking blood in hormones, is usually checking urine. Urine is going to produce a better, more clear value. And so, for individuals who are having really strong symptoms, I recommend there's either the Anito or Mira, and they make devices that are essentially test strips that check all 4 hormones and they're looking at those levels. And you can see the graph across the month as it changes, as you ovulate, as we see those spikes to give better reference and you can input your symptoms. And so you can start to see like, as my progesterone dropped, I started to feel more anxiety. Oh, as my estrogen rose, I could feel, more breast tenderness, whatever it is. We
Mhm.
can see that pop up on that. And that's just from dipping a stick in your urine in the morning and testing it as we go.
I'm really glad that you brought that up because I actually bought the Anito a few months ago on the recommendation of my OB-GYN, and I have really gotten some good data from it. And, she's kind of recommended which days to test on to see, what's rising, or if things are low. And so that's given me some really good data because you can test it anytime. You can do it at home. It just takes a couple minutes. All you need is the test kit in your phone. And so it gives you some really good information. And it's very easy to
It's a
use.
really powerful tool, and I think what's interesting is I think a lot of those, like, range somewhere around, like, $300, but something like a Dutch test, which women use to test hormones as well, could be $500 to $600, and you also are, testing urine all throughout the month, looking at levels, and it does give us, like, a little bit more comprehensive values, but what's cool about the Mira and the Anito is that you can use it month to month to month, like throughout that 7 to 10 year window of perimenopause. And it can help your provider drive better informed decisions to not be blind of having data and symptoms very similar to blood labs to say, hey, like we can see that we're seeing, better values now that you have progesterone on board, or we haven't seen a change at all. And we need to do something different and pivot.
It's great that I can just send a screenshot and we were able to talk about it. And also it's was not expensive. I think it was close to $100
Oh,
and
okay,
it
that's good to know.
the kit and then with the test strips, it's like a whole box of test strips. So I think it's like an affordable option if you're really wanting that data.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful tool. I think that's one that a lot of people miss out on. And it's like an easy touch point because it does remind you that you're not a robot. Like males' hormones are really robotic. They run the same all day long and yours don't. So it's normal to have a dynamic system that feels different in different times of the month. And having that data, I think sometimes just puts us at ease to say like those data points line up with how I'm feeling.
Yes, exactly.
So
It's a great tool. All right, next on the list is vitamin D. So we know that most women are deficient. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
yeah, so this is actually a really interesting one to me. Vitamin D is often deficient, but I think that a lot of women take vitamin D. So, two thoughts. Vitamin D does better from an absorption standpoint when it comes with a cofactor. That cofactor is K2. So, if you're taking vitamin D, you want it to be in the active form, vitamin D3, and you want it to be vitamin D3 K2. Don't buy them separately. It's too hard. Just buy one that's D3 K2. The other aspect is that vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin. So oftentimes it comes in a fat emulsion of sorts, but it's actually better if you take it with a meal where there's fat involved. So all of my patients take their vitamin D specifically with lunch or dinner, a meal that has fat in it. So you may be taking vitamin D, but if you're taking it like in the morning before breakfast or without food, you may not see the movement of better vitamin D status because of that.
So it won't absorb as well if you're
Yeah, it
not.
doesn't absorb as well. It has to have fat in order to enter the body. So this affects bone density, it affects mood, it affects your immune function. Everybody during COVID was taking vitamin D, but the values that show up as normal on this are, I believe that normal is 30 is the value that they aim for. And I like to see 50 to 80. This really drives a difference for my patients in terms of their mood and their energy. So if your vitamin D is below 50, it would be a good consideration to consider supplementing or looking at the type that you're taking or when you're taking.
Okay. And then some of the other things that it affects is bone density, I think was on the list, your mood. What are some other things?
So, energy, your immune function is a big one. And so, like, if you like, you're constantly getting sick, we look at vitamin D levels is a big one. I think people tend to take vitamin C, but like zinc and vitamin D are the ones that I look at more so.
So the next one is vitamin B12 and folate.
Vitamin B12, when it's low, can mimic depression and brain fog. And I tell you this because I have felt this. My vitamin B12 was so low, I was shocked. I'm still looking into, for me specifically, why it was so low. I was not supplementing. I have not been checked for MTHFR, which is a genetic mutation. Your body is not able to methylate B vitamins and get that kind of final conversion in order to absorb them. So I need methylated forms of B vitamins to take, but I wasn't taking anything. I think postpartum, I was just sick of taking like all my prenatals and all the things I did for milk supply. And so I didn't take them for a while, which is fine. But again, targeted supplementation matters. So for somebody who was having severe brain fog and I felt very depressed, this made a huge difference. The day I started taking it, I could feel a difference.
Wow.
I'm really excited. I just got my labs done 2 days ago. And so I'm excited to see like where the value is now so that I can assign, a mood and a symptom to a better lab value.
Yeah.
But I feel like this is a really big lift. Checking your vitamin B12 and your folate and just all of your Bs across the board can make a really big difference. And I think B vitamins are really strong and concentrated in red meat. And I think that seeing we have low iron, low ferritin, and low B values for women across the board usually shows me that people are not eating a diet that is nourishing to their body. So labs, again, not just inform supplementation, but how we should be eating. If you
Food
met with a
choice.
trainer who said, oh, if you want to lose weight, I need you to eat only lean meat and focus on chicken and fish. If I get your labs done and I see that you're low in all of these things, I'm going to say something different because yes, I want to help you lose weight, but it's not those recommendations that are going to work.
Right. And would you recommend that like everyone take a methylated version? Like, is that better or just if you
It's
have?
not better. It's not that it's better. It's just not necessary for individuals that
Okay.
don't have MTHFR because their body does that methylation fine. But there is a strong prevalence of women who don't have that MTHFR gene and are not able to methylate. This really comes up and is more pronounced during pregnancy because we worry about baby getting adequate folate and B vitamins because of that cleft lip. And so we can see that if they're not getting a methylated form in a prenatal, that we can see that develop and it's an easy fix, but it doesn't just relate to infant fetal health. It also relates to just maternal health too.
Next up are the inflammation markers that you can test for. Can you tell us about that?
Okay, last one here, HSCRP, high sensitivity CRP. This is how we measure inflammation. Specifically, this usually relates to cardiovascular risk, autoimmune flares, and insulin resistance. So if this is elevated, it could be that you are recently sick. There could be some acute inflammation going on. We would see this elevated like in the ICU if somebody was like severely ill or if they had broken a leg or gunshot wound, etc. There's inflammation in the body. But if this is elevated in a human that doesn't have a big symptom load or kind of feels normal, we get concerned that there's something else going on, like a silent factor in the body. So it could be that there is something like Crohn's or celiac at play, or we could have leaky gut. This can also be elevated if we have a lot of central obesity and a lot of fat around our organs that is inflammatory. But this is just a good driver to give us an idea of what inflammation, if at all, is going on in the body. So people talk a lot about inflammation, like right now, the peptide world of like, oh, I lost 30 pounds of inflammation. It's really not a thing. I understand if you feel like you're losing weight or you're losing water weight or you feel less lethargic, you feel better in your body, but you're losing fat usually or losing muscle or just losing body size when you're losing a lot of weight. We don't really lose inflammation. It doesn't show up like that. But this value is a really powerful tool. We like to see that it's under 1. I've seen anywhere from 3 to 10 with patients, kind of depending on what we're dealing with. But it's also non-specific. It's not going to pop up and say a 2 and it's because of your heart or a 2 and it's because of your broken leg. It's non-specific in the fact that it doesn't always point directly to the inflammatory source. And so it just gives us data, but it's not specific necessarily. I have a patient who has arthritis and joint pain. It's elevated for them. There's some inflammation going on in their joints. I have a patient who has leaky gut. It's elevated. A patient with celiac that was eating gluten. It's very elevated, but it's not always direct.
Okay. Okay. So before we wrap up, I just want to remind listeners that we have some resources that we will link. And you also offer a service where you will order and read labs. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So this past year, I had a ton of patients come to me asking for labs. They were getting pushback from their doctor. So I have a list of like a free download of labs that I recommend annually that you get. But I also have a list of doctors that I recommend in the area that will run it for you, that will take insurance. And then I also can order labs for you and you can do mobile phlebotomy at home, or you can go to lab Core or Quest and get your labs done. But if that is something that's a resistance for you, that's standing in your way of having more information, I'm happy to order those for you. I don't prescribe as a doctor, but I'm happy to order those labs so that you have more data because it really can help us decide what diet and lifestyle changes can really move the needle so that we're not just guessing and making it harder than it needs to be.
I think that that service and the guide can both be a great tool for people who are
Yeah,
looking for more information
it
and
can.
to
It's so
or
complete. And I think that, people think it's going to be really expensive. Like they go see a functional med doctor, it's like $1,200. But a good comprehensive lab panel usually is never more than $300 out the door. So it's just really good to know that once a year, if you are spending $300 to get a really good sounding board to work off of, that I feel like that makes a huge difference.
I'm glad you brought up the price because if you're saying $300, once a year, that sounds pretty doable.
About like how much money people spend on like a daily multivitamin or like a powder, fiber powder, like for an annual amount. Like if you look at your supplement bill for the year,
Yeah.
we could probably easily save you $300 a year by doing labs.
Right. And having that targeted supplementation. No, that's great. Well, any final advice or words on labs before we wrap up?
Ooh, test, don't guess, I think is my big thing. And know that working with a provider who works either with a integrative or functional, more modern approach is really important, that we're not using general reference ranges for labs, because if we did so, we would see that like thyroid health, micronutrient levels would all really suffer if we didn't look at them with the right optimal ranges.
Well, thank you so much for breaking it all down for us and making it just a lot more digestible to understand.
One
And
more step in our peri prep kit.
we hope that people will share this with a friend or family member who might need it.
Yeah.
Till next time.